Well, hello everyone and welcome. Behind the mask, it's me, Alex McInturf, for those who can't tell. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce Professor Clare Cannon. Dr. Cannon is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of California, Davis, and a research fellow in the Department of Social Work at the University of the Free State, South Africa. Using multiple kinds of methods, her research has investigated the use of intimate partner violence in sex and gender minority communities and applied feminist theories and methods to environmental injustices. She researches intersections of social inequality, health disparities, and climate and environmental injustice in urban, rural, and disaster contexts. She received her Ph.D. in City, Culture, and Community from Tulane University. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Clare Cannon.
Thanks so much, Alex. Looks like I'm live and in color here on the Zoom. So hi, everybody on Zoom in our virtual domain and space. Thanks so much for having me. I am delighted. Oh, I take my mask off? Can I really? Okay, because I teach with my mask and oh, it's so liberating. Sorry, everybody, but it's liberating. And now I can project. I'm worried about that. Yeah, so I am excited to be here with you all, talking about one of my favorite topics. I appreciate the opportunity to, gather my thoughts on the question before us today, what feminist theories and methods have to offer environmental justice and environmental sciences more broadly, and to share with you a little bit about my work. So I'm going to try to go about 40 minutes, and hopefully Alex can help me stay on time so that we have plenty of time for conversation, because I think that'll be really rich. So I want to talk a little bit. So I've tried to condense about 60 or 70 years of feminist theory in one slide. So we're going to go pretty quickly through this, just to kind of maybe whet your appetite in case you're not familiar. So these are some of the legacies and approaches that I've used in my work and that I will put to you today and argue that has a wealth of knowledge and powerful tools for advancing environmental sciences. So second wave feminism, and by this we mean Marxist critiques to STEM and nature. So thinking about science from a standpoint, thinking about and questioning objectivity and what is nature and how do we relate to it? Is it something that is so separate from humans and our societies? Black feminist thought, this is also chronological. So second wave feminism, we can say 40s and 50s, 1940s and 50s. Black feminist thought, 60s and 70s. So bell hooks, the Combahee River Collective statement, right? And so part of this movement was to say that the standpoint where Black women are located in society provides unique and important information and knowledge for us to understand and think about our world and oppression specifically. Intersectionality comes from Black feminist thought. So here I'm thinking of Kimberly Crenshaw's work and Patricia Hill Collins' work that really identifying the interlocking axes of our social location. So where we fall in society and in the hierarchy and power arrangements of society, and how that produces and maintains certain kinds of oppression. Here, we're mostly thinking about social kinds of oppression, relationship kinds of oppression, these sorts of things. Then we move into the 90s and early 2000s. This is like a fun fact I learned during my PhD. Many people thought ecofeminism would be the third wave of feminism, and it was not. And there are a variety of really interesting reasons for that to be the case. But I think relevant for us is that it's looking at the twin forces of capitalism and patriarchy and how both of these structures reinforce one another to maintain a hierarchy with men at the top, largely defined, women at the bottom, kind of inclusively or expansively defined, and how these same logics work to exploit both the earth and women. So around this time, people like Vandana Shiva and Maria Mize were looking at how capitalism and patriarchy was causing destruction in their communities. And then more recently, feminist political ecology. So building off of some of the great work of political ecology, but thinking specifically about, for example, gendered rights and responsibilities. So the ways that gender discrimination plays into producing unequal distribution of resources, unequal access to resources, and the difficulty in living with full dignity of life. So of course, I'm thinking of Richel et al., their collected works, edited volume from 1996 that I believe was republished in 2004 and updated. So that's a crash course. Happy to talk about more of those, but I wanted to orient ourselves to the many different ways of thinking with feminist theory. And so when we talk about feminist theory, we're really talking about a collection of theories. So not just one. And I argue that each of these has something to bring to the table when thinking about environmental sciences and kind of the next century of what we need to do in the environmental sciences to work towards environmental and climate justice. So I want to talk briefly before turning to environmental justice and situating us within that a little bit about method. So I am making the case that it's not just the theories, but it's also the methods. And so this can look like a lot of different strategies and tactics. So ethnography, and we can think of like mini ethnography or autoethnography, case studies, particularly feminist political ecologists will go both in communities in the global north and global south and do in-depth case studies to try to understand and explain this uneven development and access to resources. Quantitative methods, so we can think about this, and Leslie McCall's work has been super important on this topic for looking at social oppression and inequality. We can look at regression and interactive effects, and also spatial methods. And thinking about spatial methods, both in terms of the spatial imagination, what Ducret asks us to think about in terms of how do we understand space and how it's constructed and maintained, and who is it for and who does it oppress, but also spatial methods. So this can be data visualization, mapping, spatial regression, etc. So a brief, again, trying to cram a whole bunch into a short amount of time and weave together some of these big ideas. This is a really brief history of environmental justice in the US, looking across the social movements, policy, and research. So most people cite environmental justice starting in 1982 with the sit-in against Warren County, North Carolina. So Bob Bullard's book, Dumping in Dixie from 1990, really traces a lot of this work. And we have the GAOU and UCC reports in the 80s that really said, we have this thing called environmental injustice and we have to do something about it. I like to start the brief history all the way back to 1968 with the Memphis sanitation strike. So this is actually where Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, being part of this strike. The kind of famous Black men wearing placards that says, "I am a man," comes from this strike. And sanitation was one of the most, if not most dangerous jobs in the United States at this time. There were no protections. People got hurt all the time, big machinery. And of course, people of color and men of color tended to be in these positions. So we really see the kind of confluence of labor, racial justice, and the environment come together. So I think it's really important to kind of say, hey, this has been going on longer than 1982, and that the environmental justice movement is really born from both the environmental movement in the 60s, so we can think of Rachel Carson and her work with Silent Spring, and the civil rights racial justice movement in the US, kind of coming together and looking at these intersections. Some other really important dates, particularly for us in California, and you'll hear more about this group, El Pueblo, who I've had the pleasure of working with for 4 years now on an environmental health disparity study in the Central Valley, are kind of credited with being some of the first EJ movement leaders in the 80s when they stopped the expansion of the hazardous waste facility that's still located in their community. Clinton Executive Order 12898 in 1994, saying environmental justice was a thing, creating this office, and really pushing the EPA to say you have to consider environmental justice in decisions. And that has gone mediocrely well, depending on how you look at it. 2012, again, in California, we have the California Senate Bill 535, which is really important legislation that basically takes money from the carbon tax and uses Talon Bioscreen, this data tool that looks at social vulnerability and environmental vulnerability, to distribute funds, which is super interesting. So they label disadvantaged communities based on this data, and so they reinvest carbon tax into these communities. And so that's the bill that made that happen. So you can kind of see, right, we have a long way to go, but there have been some movement across the 50 years since we started this. So that's a little bit about where we come from and where we're going. But there's also really active environmental justice research, right? So I've kind of laid out in broad strokes the movement, important key sites within the history of that movement. But we can also think about environmental justice in terms of its research. So the guiding principle, what I mean by environmental justice, is that everyone has the right to an environment free from harm. And we might think that's something we could all agree on, but you would be surprised how many of us do not live in an environment that's free from harm. And we'll talk more about that, and I have some specific examples. So the first kind of round of EJ 1.0, to use this kind of crude numeric system, really focused on the uneven distribution of environmental harms. And after much debate, we decided that yes, race played a role in that. Environmental racism, so the official sanctioning of environmental decisions that disproportionately impact communities of color, right? That's what I mean by environmental racism. And class play a role in who gets exposed to these environmental harms and how they get exposed to them and who lack environmental benefits. Environmental justice 2.0, or what's called critical environmental justice. So here I'm thinking of Laura Paluto and David Pello's latest work, is thinking about the state as a site of contestation for working towards environmental justice. So environmental justice 1, a lot of folks have thought, okay, we need to work with the EPA, we need to work with the state environmental protection agencies to try to reduce harm. And EJ 2.0, after 30 years of that, is coming around and saying, the state's part of the problem, right? The state is the one who, enforced, allowed redlining. The state is the ones who disinvested to varying degrees and across varying scales communities of color, right? And so really calling into question, who are the allies in this work, and how do we move closer towards environmental justice? Because they looked back at what I just showed you and said, that's not enough. That's not enough progress. So what are we going to do differently now that we've had 30 years of environmental justice? And that's an open question. And it's linked to, so why does this matter? Why do we care about this? What is the urgency about this? Well, the urgency is climate justice, right? So climate justice, some folks lump it in with environmental justice, some folks keep it separate. I don't really care. I've added it here because it's relevant to our conversation. So this is working towards justice regarding climate impact. So everything that I've laid out for you is going to surely get worse with climate change and anticipated and already occurring impacts. So Tracy Osborne has done fantastic work on this and highlighting it and what it means for gender and women and communities all across the globe. But that really, we need to work towards climate justice. So that's not to leave environmental justice to the side, but to think about justice as a process that must include anticipated impacts from climate change, occurring impacts from climate change, as well as already existing environmental harms and social inequality. Are we together? Onward. Okay, so here's one thing that I'll say is laying out what a feminist approach to this environmental science research would look like. And I think it has 4 pillars. Acknowledging the embedded context of colonialism and oppression, So we want to think about ways of decolonizing. So oftentimes that means that the history of the landscape that we're dealing with, the history of the oppression that we're dealing with goes back a lot longer and further and deeper than we normally think about it, right? So this connects with David Pello's 4 pillars of critical EJ, where he calls for a multi-scalar approach, right? So we also need a multi-temporal dimensional approach in acknowledging to work towards addressing and redressing the harms that have been done. Identifying power embedded and operationalized through history, through place. So thinking about social location, borrowing from intersectionality, not just as the intersecting and interlocking axes of social location, but also multiple dimensions of history and place and how that plays out. Situating, so this comes straight from second wave feminists, that we have this idea of standpoint. So where I am located, my experiences inform what it is that I look at, what it is that I care about, what as a research is my lens. And so trying to situate that and to acknowledge our access to resources and limitations. And this will come into one of the examples that I'll share in a little bit of identifying and this notion of reflexivity of what I have access to and then what my community partners, these environmental justice organizations, have access to. Because it's not that I have all the power and the money and they have nothing, right? It's this it's this understanding that power and resource operates in a variety of different ways. And so to leverage those, to work towards more just futures, we really need to think about where we situated. And then finally, centering. So a lot of my community engaged participatory action research really works to center residents and their experiences. And specifically for my work, that's experiences of environmental injustice, and specifically environmental pollution and burdens. So that is my argument, that's where we're going. And that's one of the things that feminist theory and methods have to offer. I just really, I don't know, PowerPoint was like, do you like this picture? And I said, yes. And it just made me feel like important. I hope it makes you feel important. Those are not my glasses. I did not take this picture. So some supporting evidence. So I'm going to present just 2 projects that I've been working on for a few years, and I can talk about some of my other research. I am and have always been an interdisciplinary scholar, so I'm happy to talk about the trials and tribulations of doing that work. And I have a few more projects that kind of really spread the gamut, particularly in disaster context and looking at climate adaptation and city planning. But I want to focus and hone in on two kind of evidential cases. So the first is intersectional entangled risks. That's going to come out in Frontiers in Climate Risk Management, and empirical analysis of disasters and landfills. And so in this, I'm using both. I'm using feminist theory, specifically intersectionality and methods, drawing on Leslie McCall's work using interactive effects and quantitative methods to really try to understand environmental pollution in the United States. And my form of environmental pollution is waste sites. So I've been really interested in garbage now for like 15 years. For a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk more about, but this is one articulation of it. So this is just, laying on my case. It's underexplored. We don't really know what the risks are related to disasters, which we know will increase with climate change. Our landfills, to varying degree of job, to a varying degree, do a good job of protecting some communities, although not all landfills are created equal, which I'll talk a little bit about. But surely with mudslides, earthquakes in places they didn't used to be, they're not climate ready. So what does that mean for risks and risks these communities that have been experiencing environmental injustice for 50 plus years, which is the average lifespan of a landfill. I also argue that disasters create a dual risk to residents. So the immediate effect of the disaster, but also the harmful effects that disasters generate. So one of the best things you can do when a disaster hits in terms of increasing recovery is getting rid of what's often called debris as soon as possible. So when we have disasters, they create a whole bunch of toxic waste, and that waste has to go somewhere. So there are these indirect effects. And I argue that this risk is unevenly distributed, because we know from a lot of the great work from Paul Mohai and others that landfills are disproportionately located in communities of, well, I should say hazardous waste landfills and facilities listed in the toxics release inventory are located disproportionately in communities of color and poor communities. So my aim was to build on this really awesome prior research to examine empirically, so to use quantitative methods, which isn't done a lot with intersectionality theory, to look at these effects of race, class, and gender on landfills. So I spent a few years, I got an NSF doctoral grant, doctoral dissertation research improvement grant. They're always changing the name, so I'm not quite sure what it's called now. Collecting landfill data. So this meant going to every state environmental website and threatening FOIA to find their information on landfills. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. It's very effective for getting state agencies to give you certain information. And so I collected this whole data set of landfills where they were located. I have disaster data, so this is from FEMA. I have USDA urban rural continuum codes, and then sociodemographic data. And I used negative binomial regression with interaction effects to look at these impacts. So this is, to my knowledge, the first map of all the landfills in the United States. The blue, these are UC Davis colors. I was like, they'll like me if I use their colors, but then I was like, it's garbage. So I don't know how they'll feel. But all the blue are construction, demolition, industrial, and municipal, which make up 93% of all landfills in the United States and have been severely understudied. They're also regulated and managed at local and state levels. And so you can imagine that they're not regulated as severely as the hazardous waste facilities that are regulated federally. And then the yellow dots are the hazardous waste landfills. And then there's like population stuff. I thought you might be impressed as a geographer with that. So that's where they're all located. And then, you know, just good basic, teach my grad students this descriptive statistics of all my variables. Yes. Bivariate correlations, just doing my homework. Some things are correlated, some things aren't correlated. Yep. And then here are the models. So I did two models, one with the non-hazardous. So I put all three of the non-hazardous, so C&D, industrial, municipal, all together, kind of thinking that they might function similarly since they're regulated similarly, particularly construction, C&D, and industrial. Municipal slightly different, and then the hazardous waste models. And just some things that jump out that make sense, right? Population density and total population, we would expect where there are greater population, there are going to be more landfills. Interestingly, more urban places have more landfills. Disasters, so actually more rural places have more landfills. Similarly, disasters. So this follows up on some of the work I did with my advisor, Laura McKinney, where we argue that what we see with landfills and disaster waste is it actually migrates. So the waste doesn't necessarily go to where a disaster hits. So say a hurricane hits the coast of North Carolina, it's not necessarily those landfills that get the disaster debris, but that it moves across. And if we go back to our map, we can see that a lot of these landfills are concentrated in what's called the Black Belt South. So Wimberly and Morris, two rural sociologists, have done incredible work talking about the Black Belt South and the ways that there has been severe disinvestment in this more rural area throughout the southeastern United States, where I'm from. Not from all of them, I'm from Alabama, just to be clear. So again, we see what we would expect in terms of poverty and race. And then I use gender, and I use this variable that others have used, such as Liam Downey in some of his work at the census tract level, looking at different kinds of environmental burdens, where we see that the greater percentage of female-headed primary households, so these are households where there's a single female who's like leading them, that there are higher number of both non-hazardous and hazardous wastes. So then I looked at these interactions, which I will show the graphs in a minute, because I think that'll be more useful. So just in terms of the main effects of the models, some of the things that we found, right, were counties with a greater number of non-hazardous waste landfills had a negative relationship to number of disasters. So that's what I was talking about, supporting Dr. McKinney's work, our work together, and looking at, right, confirming for this universe of landfills a lot of the great work that Bob Bullard and Mohai and Saw have done. We found something somewhat surprising, was this negative association with a greater number of non-hazardous waste landfills and hazardous waste landfills and counties with average percentages of non-white residents. So there is some support of that. So that's part of what we try to unpack with the interactions, because really think that there's like a confounding effect going on there. And then finally, counties with greater counts of non-hazardous waste landfills are positively associated with gender inequality, which is a novel contribution to work on environmental justice and gender. So these are just the interactive effects. So this is the first one that came through as significant. So predicted landfill count, that's the dependent variable for negative binomial regression. We want counts, and then percent of non-white residents. And so basically looking at this and then looking at these, basically what we say, what we think is going on, or maybe the thing I should say is the theory that we're using, intersectionality theory, is driving us to interpret this to mean that these effects are entangled. And so what we mean by that is that they're more complicated. They're not multiplicative like we might expect, right? So if we think about intersectionality and we think, okay, we have these multiple social locations, and so every additional oppressed category that you're a part of, right, it's going to multiply your likelihood of experiencing environmental burden. That's not what we find, right? Which I think is somewhat surprising. So how do we explain what it is that we find? We think that it's way more complicated than just exponential multiplication. We think that social and environmental oppression unfolds in ways that are difficult to predict, nonlinear, and what Einstein called, when he was talking about quantum mechanics, as spooky action at a distance. That there isn't just this one-to-one relationship in terms of saying being a queer woman or being, a Black woman or something like this, that it happens in different ways. And so one of the things that intersectionality and feminist political ecology can help us understand is that it's not just that people are experiencing oppression, but that we argue they inform and enact their own kinds of resistance. And so one of the ways that we show this is that a lot of the leaders in local environmental justice movements specifically are women, and they're women of color. And I have the privilege and honor of working with a number of people in the Central Valley along these lines. And so what we're saying is this isn't just the case of, okay, if you are every oppressed identity category and marker, then you're going to experience X number more oppression. We're saying that you are going to experience more oppression, and you're also going to develop resistance in different ways. And that's why we like the term entangled, because it's a lot messier than something that's linear and multiplicative. And it leaves room for the enactment and the power of these marginalized and minoritized communities to fight for, and the ways that they're working towards more environmental just outcomes in their own communities. And so this is following some of the stuff Tracy Osborne has recently published. This is following a lot of Mollett's work. This is following Ducret, and really thinking about, and intersectionality theorists are telling us that this isn't just about all the oppression that people are facing, but it's about the actions that people are also taking in the face of that, right? This is a dynamic system. And so that's really important to keep at the heart of that. And that's one of the things that feminist theory and intersectionality theory in particular can teach us, is that it's not just about quantifying social inequality, but it's about thinking and acknowledging and identifying the ways that those communities are also responding and reacting to their circumstances, or the power arrangements that have created these forms of oppression. Okay, how am I doing on time, Alex? Okay, great, because those are my conclusions for this. So we looked at examining risk disparities and advancing intersectionality theory by bringing in environmental outcomes and quantitative approaches, which are both relatively novel within intersectionality studies. And we're extending environmental justice and environmental science research through using an intersectionality theory for the research design and interpretation of these data to empirically analyze risk disparities from landfills and disasters. Lots of limitations. I always tell my undergrad and my graduate students, I'm like, you have to have a limitation slide, and that those are opportunities for future research. So there's a lot of messiness with our data. It's cross-sectional, it's not longitudinal, it's not fine-grained, such as at the census tract level, but it is subnational, which is great because that's a level that's missing within environmental justice research. And also that this is a unit hazard coincidence method, and that there's some distance-based methods that have worked really great for looking at some of these relationships. So these are also future avenues for research. So I want to, in the time that I have, talk about another piece of supporting evidence. So another case of some of my work that's been published, and we have a policy brief and community fact sheet, and actually a documentary, short documentary, that was just featured at the American Public Health Association a couple of weeks ago, that I can send a link to if people are interested. But this is a pilot study funded by the UC Davis Environmental Health Sciences Center, the Center for Regional Change, the UC Davis Feminist Research Institute, the Agricultural Experiment Station at Davis. And I will talk a little bit about this. So Kettleman City is halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. There's a very famous In-N-Out there. Lots of people stop. It's this red flag here. It's off of I-5, which is probably the fastest way to get from San Francisco to LA. It's a rural, agricultural, Latinx community of 300 households, 1,500 people. And this research came out of a landmark settlement between our community partners, Green Action and El Pueblo, with the state of California, in which the state of California said, yes, this is an environmental justice issue. No, we have no money for you. But if you want to go and find, we'll help you to go and find research funding to study environmental health. So that's what we did. And it's an important site because, as I mentioned previously, it's considered one of the birthplaces of environmental justice activism and scholarship. So this is it. This is the Class 1 hazardous waste landfill. They just look like rolling hills with fences around them. It's easy to confuse with, say, a state park, except for the fact that you can't walk along it, and I would not recommend it. And so this is one of 2 Class 1 hazardous waste landfills in the state of California. These kinds of landfills take mostly byproduct from oil refining processes. It's also the only licensed handler of PCBs, which we'll talk a little bit about in the state of California. And so community partners approached me about doing the study because they wanted to know what was in their environment that could be harming their health. And so we designed this study with researchers at UC Davis associated with the Environmental Health Sciences Center. So we wanted to determine the key linkages between health, sociodemographics, and environmental exposure, characterize the presence and concentration of that exposure, and apply this, this version of a CBPR model so that we could take, evaluate it, take lessons learned, and apply it to other similarly affected communities to inform socio-environmental decision-making and policy. So some strengths of CBPR, and I would say with the feminist approach twist, is it improves the quality, validity of the research, enhances the relevance and usefulness of the research data. It aims to improve the health and well-being of communities, and it aims to reduce disparities and injustices. So we're very transparent about our job isn't just to go in and collect environmental and biological data, but our job is to go in and try to help decision makers make better decisions to reduce environmental injustice and also to build community civic and adaptive capacity through this work. So this is what we did. My PhD is in sociology. So when my community partners were like, we want you to take our biological data, like I had like Foucault in my head, I had like biopower. I was like, you want me to do what? But I talked to my friends at Public Health Sciences and they're like, oh yeah, no, we do it all the time. Like IRB is minimal risk. And I was like, what? And it is. I like got an exempt IRB, which is amazing. As a sociologist, I was like, there's no way. But we have great folks at Davis who help make our research possible. So we started with this environmental health community health survey, where we went door to door. It was like 106 degrees on an October afternoon. We went door to door to every household. We collected environmental data. So we had a cohort of 10 and we collected indoor water samples. And then we did we did a 2-week particulate matter and VOC air quality sampling. And then we did biomonitoring. So we collected serum and plasma. And really the community said, these are the things that we're worried about. We're worried about diesel from the trucks going to the landfill. We're worried about PCBs from the landfill. We're worried about the traffic. We're worried about, we know our water is contaminated and we've been on a bottled water program because we can't drink it. But we see the benzene smokestack that's literally taking benzene out of the water and pumping it into the air. I mean, they have so much chlorine in their water that I would turn on the shower and like it would just burn my nose, my eyes, all of it. And so we wanted to try to capture that as best we could. So this is our door-to-door survey. It was way too long. If I have this to do over again, I'm not going to make an 86 item survey. It was like 20 or 30 minutes out there with my undergrads and my graduate students, with people. But we got a lot of really rich data from that. And our response rate's pretty comparable to other rural surveys in small communities where you don't offer incentives, which is another thing that I would do differently. So just a little bit, basically, that of the folks that we talked to, so 10% of households, people were worried about the environmental pollution in their neighborhood, in their community. Truck idling was something that was really important to the community partners. And so we put some questions on there to help their advocacy efforts. But basically, we were worried about it. And one of the things with water, although no one drank it, there are other forms of exposure. So laundry, washing dishes, cooking, etc. Showering. So we did air quality sampling. So we did a few different kinds. This was a little bit of a pre-pilot. So we took these novel microgas pre-concentrator samplers to measure VOCs, which are basically gases in the air. And so we did an indoor, outdoor, and vapor from a shower. And this is a little bit of what we found. So this is just retention over time of different VOCs. This is from outdoor. So I didn't pay for like the calibration samples because I didn't have funding to do that for this project. But basically, so that's why it's a putative ID. But basically, we saw derivatives of benzene. And benzene is related to different forms of cancer and other kinds of adverse health outcomes. So we also did this pre-pilot and we found high levels of particulate matter in the air. So PM 2.5 is something that people really worry about. And so this is just a little bit of comparison with Fresno, which is using the same sampler, this improved network. And it was also in the Central Valley because Central Valley notoriously has really poor air quality. And Kettleman had way more particulate matter, particularly black carbon, which is a measure for diesel in their air. So Central Valley, poor air quality. Kettleman City, even worse in our samples. So this gets at this a little bit. We have here Fresno as the site code and then Kettleman City, and you can see the values are just a lot more with total elemental carbon and total organic carbon. So we think this is pretty clear evidence that we need to do more advanced sampling. And so we're putting in grants to do wind conditional sampling for the full year so we can get some seasonal data with that as well, because we think it's pretty clearly that there's something going on here. So we want to tie it to the sources. VOC sampling, we also did for 2 weeks, but there are a variety of limitations to it. Basically, we had this big trailer and those are on top. And we think that the filters degraded. So the PM is used to like kind of being out there in the hot sun for like 2 weeks in August, but the VOC samplers weren't. So we have thoughts on how we can do this differently or better next time. Thank you. So we have to do water sampling. This is a lot of text. Basically, it means that water contamination is bad and it is bad for you. And it is a notorious problem in the San Joaquin Valley where we are. And so we wanted to look at the water contamination, but we knew that some people drank it, but most people didn't drink the water. And we know that there are elevated levels of arsenic and benzene because that's what the state water report says. We also tested it and that's what we found too. And so we decided to focus on THMs and HAAs, which can kind of reform with all the chlorine that's in the water, and that can be bad for people, but we didn't really find anything. So we looked at 10 households, but we didn't really see anything that was too alarming with these. So for the next part of the study, we're not probably going to focus on water, in part because they also switched water sources in the meantime. And so this is just a little bit of what we did, but didn't really come up with very much. So biological sampling. So PCBs, polychlorinated biophenols, have been linked with low birth weight, different forms of cancers, diabetes, endocrine disruption. And so we know that PCBs are really bad for people. And so we took 10 samples of plasma and serum, and we had them analyzed for 49 different kinds of PCBs. We found some of the PCBs that you would typically expect to find at levels that were comparable to the National Health Assessment, the NHANES, for this ethnic group. But we found some PCBs that you don't normally find. And so we take this to mean that we need to do an expanded cohort study with more extensive biological monitoring, because we think it's kind of surprising that we're finding these PCBs that don't normally show up, and is that attributable to the landfill or not? And so that's an open question that's important. So limitations, it's preliminary research, it's pilot study, and I would like to close with what I argue feminist theories and methods have to offer environmental justice. So in the first example, we talked about specifically intersectionality theory and feminist methods to look at instances and to understand occasions of environmental injustice. In the second example, we used a feminist CBPR approach in working with our community partners to design the research in a way that recognized and centered their experiences as residents. I would go and sit in residents' living rooms and hear about their concerns. And so the whole research was designed to answer their questions about the environment and health. And so if I had to kind of zoom back out and have conclusions about these examples and about the case that I have made to you, and you all can decide if it's persuasive or not, is that feminist theories and methods offer environmental sciences broadly and environmental justice specifically a focus on not just power and kind of the state's power, but the processes and arrangements of that power and how they get deployed and resisted to. How to locate inequalities across scales. So not just to say we need to look across scales, but how to do that across scales, intersections, and different domains. To span and cross and traverse boundaries, including across race, ethnicity, class, gender, immigration status, disability, etc. To use interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspectives, because a lot of times feminist theories have a home discipline, but their work is outside of that, where they didn't really fit someplace else, and so they developed this work, right? So a lot of it is a bunch of what I would call misfits. And misfits tend to be really good at doing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. That's what happens when you don't have a comfortable habitat. And finally, to engage novel research methods and interpretations. So to try to think outside the box on what it is that we think that we're finding, and to do that with a point. And the point is to do work that matters. And I would argue there is no greater work that matters than fighting injustice and working towards more just futures. So lots of people to thank. Here's a lot of people to thank. And I have questions. Is that a question in the back? Okay, there's three.
More specifically related to work in the Central Valley. I have myself a product of that lovely area to talk about.
What part?
I went to school at Bakersfield.
Oh yeah, I am Bakersfield.
What I always heard growing up was that the prevailing air currents bring down pollution from San Francisco down to the valley. And I've always been accepted that. But I wonder, do you happen to know what degree that's been studied and whether there is significant outside the Central Valley more affluent areas?
Yeah, so I actually can show you what that looks like. Oh, thank you. Thanks for reminding me. Okay, so the question was from someone who is from Bakersfield, California, in the Central Valley, is that air pollution flows through the San Francisco Bay down through the valley. It like creates this pathway. That's true. I actually have that wind data. I just need to pull it up. But I don't know if everybody wants to watch me like rifle through my computer to do that. In short, yes, but what's cool about the Central Valley, actually, I'm gonna do it. Sorry, everybody. You're gonna see all my secrets, except for the people online. I don't know if they can see what this is, because this is really cool. And a buddy of mine I work with is an atmospheric scientist. And he put this together for me from wind data that we looked at. Windy, does anybody know that app? Okay, here it is. Oh, you don't see, so you did not see me going through my secrets. Okay, so, oh gosh, what are the people online seeing? No, like, are they seeing this? Yeah. Oh, awesome. Okay, so this is exactly that. So this is like frequency of observation. So this is at like looking at wind events that are faster than 2 meters per second. Because this is the algorithm that we would do for wind conditional sampling. So basically, anytime there's a wind that's greater than 2 meters per second, we would capture the PM and VOCs of that and drop it in like a different bucket, so that we could basically trace the source of the pollution to the amount of pollution that is going on. And then this is like the total VOCs or whatever over time that we got from that area, like looking at the data. And then those are the atmospheric concentrations. So basically, like what's cool about the Central Valley is if you look at the historical wind data, and you can go on like, I think it's called Windy, and look, is it comes from all different directions. So you'll have wind, so that's definitely probably the predominant one, which kind of comes up and goes down. But you also have some that are coming off the Sierras that like come and go down. And then sometimes you have some coming up from like almost like LA and coming down. So what's really cool is that like the wind is going kind of every direction, which is why, now that I'm telling you this, I'm like, I should have made this clear in the grant application. But that's part of why this is so cool, is because like we can collect source pollution from every direction because the wind is coming from every direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
These are my secrets. I don't know. I don't get out of here unless someone else has questions about future research. Oh gosh, let me out of here. Okay. We have a question online. Let's take an online question and then I'll get to you. And then I'll get to you.
Okay, so the question is, what happens when these landfills crash?
What did get me? Okay, so really brief, because it's super fun. I was like pre-med, I took the MCAT, I was like hardcore. And then I had this great undergrad advisor, and I did not do any of those things. So I got really interested in American studies and gender and women's studies, obviously. And I liked garbage and waste because I felt like it was the physical manifestation of what's left over in the system of capital. So I think waste is it's a moral wake-up call to the ways that we live our lives, and by extension of the ways we live our lives, both the systems that we create, but also the oppression that is a prerequisite for those systems. And I feel like waste is this thing that, like, try as you might, you can't ignore. Like, I don't know if anyone has like not had the garbage collected, but I lived in New Orleans for 5 years, and it stinks. Like, it is not a good experience to like be surrounded by like your refuse. And so I got really interested in systems of capital and Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and all of those things in undergrad. And I thought waste is something that really demands our attention, and it's something that we want to look away from. And so I went to Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University for a master's in social ethics to try to trace what that means ethically for us. And then somehow I ended at Tulane in New Orleans, and it became more like quantitative social sciencey, which is cool too. But that's kind of how, and so I'm still interested in it, which is cool because I remember my first day of like my PhD, they were like, all of you are going to change your topics. Like, everyone who came in here with your research statement, that's not, and they were like, except for you, Claire, because like, that's, yeah, like you seem pretty committed to that. And that's like a sexy topic. I was like, oh, garbage is sexy, cool. Like, we've just really gone around the bend, jumped the shark on that one. But they were right. But I found like different permutations and articulations of it, which is cool. Yeah.
So I'm struck by the
I can't wait.
tracing of the implications of feminism.
Yeah.
And one of the ways, I don't remember which ways, is the challenges of state power.
Uh-huh.
And then by your first study, it says, oh, yeah, we can show that there are these intersectional impacts
Uh-huh.
of exposure to waste. And my brain naturally goes to what can we, through our governmental structures, do about it. But I wonder if that's not really the way that sort of feminist thought would take us. And would rather take us to thinking about how do we, that essentially we interpret this, and I think you kind of said this, we interpret this as an outcome of the state structure. And how do we resist and change that? But is there a way to do that? And I think your second statement is really nice because it says, let's work with the communities.
Yeah.
And identify the sources of the impact. But then, is there a way to translate that back into state processes? And I think your timeline of environmental justice shows how successful work here translated into governmental action. I wonder if that makes sense or how it all ties together.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think one, different oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So the comment, if I have to like reduce it down and question, was we have feminist theories and talking about the state, and can the state be an ally with different regulatory and government structures in reducing and eliminating environmental injustice? Yes, good. Okay. So I would say what's cool is that, like, pick a different kind of feminist theory or thought and you're going to get a different answer. And similarly, this is great because it picks up a thread, I don't know if I did justice to, of environmental justice research. So Laura Paluto and her critical environmental justice work really calls into question, can we reform state structures or do we have to transform them? Right. And I think in my reading of her work, she falls on like, we need to transform them. Like the state has been part of, so she does a lot of work on uncovering racial capitalism and the results of environmental harms and oppression through racial capitalism in the United States and elsewhere. And so I think she, in my reading, kind of firmly comes down on like, no, we need to transform. Like the state has hindered more than it's helped. I think someone like David Pello and his work in critical environmental justice actually says that in one of his pillars of critical EJ is like transformer reform. Like some people can work towards reforming, and reforming would be getting in those positions, right? So DTSC, Department of Toxic Substance Control, has an environmental justice office. I know the people who work there. They're really good people and they care. And so a reform strategy would be getting into those positions and trying to reform the state structures. And that can be policy, legislative, that could be agency, regulatory, et cetera. And so I think David Pello offers us a way to say, okay, some people can work to transform and some people can work to reform. I think he still thinks it's an open question of like, do we all have to fall on one side or another? In terms of the feminists, you're going to get different answers. So I've done a little bit of work with energy justice and like gender and development and energy. And there are a lot of people who are like, okay, this policy mechanism, this regulatory structure can help reduce gender, like energy poverty related to gender and these sorts of things. And then there's some pretty radical, like feminist political ecologists that are like, we need revolution. Like the only way that we are going to live right, and eco-feminists, like the only way that we are going to like be able to inhabit this earth as a species and to end like oppression is like full sail revolution. And it really begs the question. And so some work like Ruthie Gilmore and Catherine McKittrick and who else I have my students read, a few others that are, you know, it's saying like democracy, and Morgan, Edmund S. Morgan, right, his book from the 1970s, like our democracy is rooted in genocide and enslaving people. And like, how do we, as inheritors of that and this political structure, can we reform it to a place where it's going to treat people right? So I think, you know, it comes back to this, you know, which do you fall on, right? Do we need to transform and overthrow and have full on revolution? Or do we need people to, you know, do we need these EJ advocates to run for office? Do we need, you know, you all to be in positions of power to really kind of get us where we need to do? And there's a ticking clock, right? Like there's a full scale sense of urgency. Like there's an emergency going on. There's a climate emergency going on. So it's not like we have all the time in the world to kind of figure it out. I, in my youth, was like super into revolution, and now I'm like very pragmatic. And I'm like, reform, transform, whoever wins. Like we gotta go. We gotta get on this. And so I don't necessarily see reforming and transforming as being diametrically opposed. I don't see them as binaries. And so I think we can work towards both at the same time. And I think we must. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
You mentioned in a few slides how climate change could potentially complicate or accelerate or disrupt a lot of these things. So I'm wondering if you are involved in or aware of any research that connects the dots between some of these case studies and bigger global changes like climate change.
I am. Yeah, some of my work actually. No, I really appreciate that question. So Tracy Osborne, she's the new director of the UC Center for Climate Justice. Her work is fantastic in connecting particularly feminist political ecology and climate change, both kind of case studies in the global South, and then kind of what does the global question mean? Some of my work with Eric Chu, Dr. Eric Chu at UC Davis has looked at climate adaptation planning, which has been super fun. So to look at kind of getting back to your question, what are cities doing and how do we help cities really integrate and put at the center of their climate action planning, climate justice and equity. And so some cities are doing really fantastic thing. And so looking at the data, we're thinking about and trying to argue ways to kind of help push that forward in a number of ways. And then a lot of my work with intimate partner violence looks at intimate partner violence as an acute form of social vulnerability to disasters and how that's accelerating with climate change. And so some of my work has looked at resilience and vulnerability within COVID-19, as well as other disaster contexts like flooding in New Orleans and other things. Yeah. Thank you. It's time. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast. I really appreciate all the thoughtful questions and your attention, for letting me share a little bit about what I do. Yeah.